Thanks, Todd. I also just hit the start record button. So if you get a prompt on your screen that says consent to this, then please do so. And then again, we'll be posting this up to our website within the next couple of weeks, so that if you want to review any of the slides or information, then you can do so on your own time, or if you have to leave early. So again, thanks, Todd, for inviting me. Today we're going to be all about the red grapes. And I did want to put up a couple of reminders. Again, I know the conference registration deadline had passed last week, I believe, but you can likely still register if you have not. Again, our conference is free and open to the public this year. So for y'all who are out of state, if you would like to join that conference event, you're more than welcome to. That conference is also going to be recorded with the keynote speakers presentations all pre-recorded, and then a live Q&A session on the days of Monday through Wednesday, the 15th through the 17th. Yesterday, we added a workshop that is sponsored by the Drift Sense company based out of Israel. That's a herbicide drift and pesticide drift modeling startup company that we have been working with through Dr. Doug Doohan, who is the OSU lead specialist. And that's going to be all about crop, legal, and application of herbicide and herbicide drift. So that is also a free event that's going to be on Thursday, February 4th in Eastern Standard Time. That's going to be 12 to 1 p.m. We have our upcoming Winter Grape School, March 4th. That's where the bulk of our Pest Ed recertification credits are going to come from. That would normally be as part of the conference event. And then we have the annual Worcester Pruning Workshop, March 10th. That's it. And all of these are going to be virtual. So they're all free, and you just have to click the registration links in order to sign up. In order to find those links, just go and visit our website at Ohio Grape Web under the events tab at the top of the website. And that'll provide you a list of all of the event dates, as well as the links to those event registrations. So I'd like to thank the OSU Viticulture and Enology team for their support each and every year, especially Diane and Ahmed. They're here today. Ahmed is our viticulture faculty professor, and Diane is our research assistant out at Unit 2 in Worcester. They help take care of all of the vine plantings that we have, as well as Todd for inviting me to participate with him today. And then the Ohio Grape Industries Committee, which is our sponsoring organization. So again, today is all about the red wines. Last week was all about the white wines. And again, we'll be providing tie-ins to the season overview and the weather and what happened as a result of those in the vineyard that can end up in the winery. So last week, we talked a lot about this spring rain and cool temperatures, as well as the mid-season drought effects on the white grapes. Today, I wanted to focus the bulk of the time on the spring freeze events that we had, as well as a delayed start to the growing season because of the cool temperatures. So if you remember, and we'd all like to forget 2020, but back in April, we had about 7 below freezing, below 32° Fahrenheit events that occurred between April 10th and May 13th, which for the vast majority of us from southern to a lot of northern Ohio, we had already experienced bud break, especially among the early varieties, the early cold hardy varieties from the University of Minnesota, like Marquette and La Crescent. And so this is just kind of a reminder of those times we would like to forget. So you can see here for April 17th, pretty much the entire state was below 30 degrees and into the 20s. And some spots even colder, into the upper teens. Same again, May 9th, which is incredibly late, especially for the southern portion of the state, where the last date of frost is typically between April 15th and May 1st. And even again, as late into May 12th, most of the state was in the 30s. And this was the event that we all really grit our teeth on and turned on those wind machines to try to protect that fruit, especially the Chardonnay up in the northeast corner of the state and on over into Sandusky. The pockets of what we typically consider cold areas in the state, being Mansfield and then parts of Western Ohio, were again well into the 20s during that event. So certainly a lot of opportunities for primary bud injury. And it's pretty safe to say, in the growers that I've spoken with, as well as our own experience in Worcester, that most of Ohio had some amount of primary shoot injury during the start of 2020. Pretty much the entire state, with the exception of the far northeast areas, had some form of primary shoot loss. Especially some of the early to mid bud break varieties, and those mid bud break varieties are obviously going to be farther south, where they're much more advanced in the spring in terms of bud break development than we are in Worcester and the northern parts of the state. The late varieties, those like Chamberson, Cabernet, the latest of the late, were generally okay, but they definitely had their bud break pushed back by several days to weeks as a result of these cold temperatures through April and into early May. So I know most of us are familiar with this, but I just wanted to show it once again. This is the primary shoot of Marquette that suffered primary, actually, and in this case, some secondary shoot loss as a result of one of those April events, and this is far southern Ohio. And you can see along with that, the loss of those primary clusters as well. So we definitely mourn our lost yield as a result of that event. But as we know, grapes are compound buds, so they do produce secondary and tertiary shoots in response to freeze events, both in the winter and in the spring. And on some varieties, they can produce anywhere between 20 to 70% of the primary shoot yield on those secondary shoots. Of course, that lower end is going to be more of the vinifera varieties that are lower cropping after the loss of the primary shoot. But in some cases, varieties like Marquette can produce upwards of 70% of their original yield on those secondary shoots. Again, this is variety dependent though, and varieties range that spectrum. Secondary shoots also develop quite a bit after that freeze event, 2 to 3 weeks. In some cases, temperature dependent, of course, behind the loss of those primary shoots. And we know that fruit quality is often lower in association with secondary shoots. That's not always the case, but it can be. And of course, because those shoots are later, that fruit develops later, that fruit ripens later, that can impact the ultimate outcome and quality of that fruit as well. So is yield loss always a bad thing? And actually, in my opinion, the answer is no. And in most cases, with a lot of red grapes in particular, we need, in our cool climate, to actually control that crop yield. So even with the freeze damage, yes, it is definitely a yield loss. It's not always negative, though, in some cases. Moderate yield loss, we know, can improve the remaining crop quality, especially among high yielding varieties, due to the increased vegetation area and the decreased amount of fruit to ripen. So the net effect of losing that yield to a frost event is tantamount to the same mechanism as cluster thinning, right? You want to increase the amount of photosynthate that's generated by those leaves and ultimately ends up in the fruit in the form of bricks, acid degradation, phenolics, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that accelerated ripening from lower yields can help in catching up that fruit maturity, especially from the later emerging secondary shoots. So just because that fruit quality, it can be associated as being lower from secondary shoots, the compounding effect of the accelerated maturity can help sort of decrease that gap, if you will. So I wanted to talk a little bit about cluster thinning in general, a little bit about yield loss and that change in the ratio of vegetation to fruit area on the vine. And of course, I'm going to use Chamberson as our quintessential classic example because it's such an overdramatic variety when it comes to impacts on high crop levels and the outcomes in the fruit and in the vine. So this is an example of Chamberson that has not been thinned, that is approaching veraison or the time of the onset of ripening. And Chamberson is used as a classic example because it typically produces a lot of clusters per shoot, typically 3, sometimes 4 in some cases. It produces on secondary shoots and latent buds. And as an outcome of that high crop level, often displays symptoms in its leaves in terms of yellowing and some chlorosis, as well as stunted shoot growth. But because this is a post-fermentation workshop, I really wanted to talk about the enological impacts of unthinned chamberson. And that is that it typically results in thin, high acid, light colored juice with very low Brix. It can also, from at least the vine perspective, again, cause weak shoot growth, distress and deficiency symptoms. And we know that with heavy crop load, there's a carryover effect into bud winter hardiness. So often those buds are not quite as winter hardy. They can succumb to winter injury much easier than those that have developed under less yield levels, lower yield levels. So there are a number of other red varieties that can also benefit from crop level management, particularly when we're talking about those with heavier crop levels, as well as those that ripen very late. So Regent, as an offspring of chamberson, is another good example of a variety that could benefit from crop level adjustment, especially in terms of winter hardiness. We know Regent is primarily a vinifera hybrid. And so its cold hardiness is not going to be as great as those of much higher non-vinifera hybrid parentage. So adjusting that crop level could improve your cold hardiness there. Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon in particular tend to also be high crop levels, but also very late ripening, especially in the case of Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, removing some of that yield can help bolster and accelerate that ripening process, particularly for the coolest parts of the state up in Northeast where Cab Sauv is grown, and help push that to maturity and decrease some of those green vegetative characteristics that can be associated with both Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. Cour Noir and Marcel Foch are two hybrid examples that can benefit from crop thinning, primarily because they are prolific at producing on secondary shoots. So if you don't shoot thin, you don't cluster thin, those can also result in more vegetative tasting wines, lower color fruit, and negatively impact the overall quality of that wine. The other thing I wanted to touch upon that, of course, is very important in red grapes in our cool climate, again, particularly in the northern parts of the state, is leaf removal. And leaf removal is more beneficial, not just from the UV exposure and the improved phenolic development of those wines, but also disease management. And that's why regardless of where you are in Ohio, whether you're cool climate, northern Ohio, or hotter, warmer southern Ohio, leaf removal is so important for disease management to open up that canopy, allow airflow. And we now know that UV light can help kill spores of powdery mildew, so it can certainly aid in a lot of mid-season disease control. It's good from both the fruit quality perspective, it's good from the disease management perspective, it's also good in bud development. We know from some studies in Concord and the Finger Lakes that sunlight exposure to buds as they develop throughout the season on the shoots can improve cold hardiness by 10, 20 degrees or so. And so it's really important to not leave your buds in a highly shaded environment as well, just to improve cold hardiness, because we know that can be so problematic for the Midwest and the Northeast. So again, all varieties, red, white, gray, all benefit from some level of fruit zone defoliation. We talked about this quite a bit in May when we had our webinar series, but the timing and the extent of canopy defoliation are certainly heavily dependent on the variety, site location, as well as the training system. As we know, for instance, high wire cordon leaf exposure can create more intensive of light exposure than a vertical shoot position system where you're shaded by the top of the canopy above the fruit zone. So you definitely want to be careful when exposing your fruit, but again, all varieties will benefit from some amount of exposure. And of course, timing your practice is very critical to the outcome of both of these practices, both leaf removal as well as cluster thinning. And in this instance, I'm only talking about what we consider traditional leaf removal, which is post-fruit set through veraison. So this is just a phenological timeline of the post-bloom period. Fruit set typically occurs about a week or so after bloom, all the way through bunch closure, which is when the berries start to touch. This progression usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks. It depends on the season, depends on the temperatures. So it can change from year to year, but the phenological stages remain pretty constant, which is why we use them. And for leaf removal, we do know that the earlier you perform it closer to fruit set, the better off you are in regards to preventing some sunburn, which can be problematic as we start to approach late June and early July. We're sort of ripping off that shade that's been protecting those young developing berries, can create some skin blotchiness and problems from sunburn. So the earlier you can do it towards fruit set, the better off you are. And then with cluster thinning, the generally recommended time is between about pea size to bunch closure. If you perform it too late after bunch closure, you lose a lot of the sink removal effects that cluster thinning can benefit from. But if you do it too soon before pea size, then you run into this problem of the berry compensation effect, which you'll still have to some degree when you perform it in here. But the result is less dramatic. So by berry compensation, I mean, typically those berries that have been on the remaining clusters of those vines tend to increase in size as a response to the lower sink levels, and sink being the fruit that exist on those vines. So the berries tend to be bigger. The clusters tend to get a little bit more compact. So if you have a variety that is already highly compact and you go and you perform some cluster thinning, maybe consider doing it just a touch after pea size, closer to bunch closure, to avoid as big of an effect on those remaining berries. Again, the closer to veraison and in the post-veraison that you wait, the fewer benefits that you see and receive from both cluster thinning and leaf removal. So again, be wary of your timing, be wary of your variety, your site conditions, and so forth before performing any of these canopy management techniques. We know, thanks to our friends in Michigan, that the season does matter in regards to the impact of cluster thinning and leaf removal. So we know that regardless of what season conditions you have, cluster thinning and leaf removal do accelerate the ripening process, but whether there's a significant quality improvement does depend on the year. So what they found is that in hot years, during the time period of veraison to harvest, cluster thinning and leaf removal perform pretty similarly to a non-manipulated canopy. That's the good news. But in cool years, cluster thinning and leaf removal both resulted in higher crop quality and ripening uniformity of the remaining fruit on the vine. And that's where the benefit really comes from, is this fact that the weather is just simply not predictable. So you're better off not playing that guessing game and taking the marginal gains that you can get in the best years rather than missing out on the major benefits and outcomes that you would get in the worst season conditions. And again, the disease management, regardless, benefits, especially from leaf removal. So practicing these every single year, optimizing your yield levels to your vegetative growth of those vines, all very important to the outcome of your crop. So let's talk a little bit about how this played out during the 2020 season when we look at GDD. Again, the start of the season was really cool, all the way up through mid-May. We were well below average. And as a result, that GDD stayed relatively below average until the later part of the season, where we caught up really between July and October. We definitely had above average temperatures in the late part of the season that helped bolster the really cool start that we had. So the good news is, despite that cool start, I say all's well that ends well. Our red varieties overall were able to reach maturity in 2020, and that seems to be consistent despite where you are in the state. So folks in Southern Ohio reached maturity, folks in far Northeast Ohio reached maturity, and everywhere in between. So that didn't seem to be quite as limiting of a factor as we all had thought. Again, at the end of the season, we ended up approximately at the 30-year average of about 3,000 GDD in Worcester. And that's just enough to ripen some of those very late varieties that we have planted here, like Chamberson. Again, with Chamberson, I did definitely get a couple of phone calls back in the fall, especially September timeframe, that asked about why they had such a low Brix. And we're talking around 17, 18 Brix, when really they should have been closer to 20 to 21 Brix at this time. And what it came down to was simply the fact that these Chamberson were struggling to reach maturity due to the high crop level. So again, this really underscores the importance that no matter where you are, if you're growing Chamberson, it needs to be thinned to at least 1 to 2 clusters per shoot in order for that to reach maturity. In average years like this, especially in cool years, and in hot years, again, it can still benefit. So like we were talking last week, we usually have a very negative perception of rain for very good reason. But this year we can kind of be really thankful that we received the rain that we did and when we did, because if you look back at July, and I know this was the case, we have at least one individual from Pennsylvania here, and I kept track of the area there because most of what we see in Ohio tends to push east. And we were, again, mild to moderate drought conditions throughout most of the state for the month of July. And I'm very thankful that in August, that pattern changed a little bit to bolster up the rainfall. And we were above average precipitation for the month of August, and then close to average in September, October. But the benefit of that higher August rainfall to sort of negate some of the drought conditions we saw in July is that we were able to increase the turgor pressure of those berries through veraison into ripening, which meant there was a lower risk of berry desiccation and shriveling. So that rainfall actually was beneficial. The other thing that had occurred with those rain events, and I didn't put up the daily precipitation, is that most of those events were larger soaking rains. They weren't heavy flash flood rains, which usually just run off the soil surface. But that soil was able to absorb those rains. And because they were more punctuated, they weren't just like, oh, it rained for 2 weeks. There was time in between those events where the fruit was able to dry out. We got the berry turgor pressure we really needed, and we were able to avoid berry swell and split, which can cause late season rots from botrytis and sour rot. So those were actually good positive rainfall events, which we do need. So regardless of our thoughts about rain, precipitation is very important. It's just the timing, quantity, and duration of those rain events are really important to what happens later in the season. The last observation I wanted to make for 2020 is about the birds and the bees. We were talking a little bit about that in regards to the ice wine before the workshop began. And yeah, birds are definitely a problem midwinter for that, but yeah, they're awful when it comes to pre-harvest problems. And that's because we know that both birds and bees are affiliated with sour rot conditions and splitting those berries open, bringing in attracting the fruit flies. Those fruit flies lay or deposit acetobacter, wild yeast, and other microorganisms that then effectively convert that sugar that's already in the berry, because typically onset of sour rot starts around 15 Brix in the late summer, early fall. And that's what causes the vinegar-like smell that is really the hallmark of sour rot. So it's a pretty good idea if you have sour rot every year and you're having difficulty managing it, to go ahead and start managing it with some low PHI insecticides in combination with a antibacterial, antimicrobial product like Oxidate is a common one. One thing to consider though is that what you rotate and how frequently you rotate does matter, because they're finding in the Finger Lakes that fruit flies are becoming insecticide resistant And that's not necessarily associated with the vineyards themselves. They could be coming in from, say, dairy barns or other neighboring farms where there are a lot of fruit flies that they'll then spray, that then find their way into the vineyard. And as a result, those insecticides that we had been previously using, like Mustang Max and other contact insecticides, then become less effective over time. So in the same way that fungicides and herbicides become resistant, insecticides do too. And when you're talking about spraying weekly insecticides for 3-4 weeks into the end of the season, that can become problematic over time. So just be careful of that. And Cornell has released a rotational schedule for insecticides that are, at least they're approved labels in New York. So always check the label, always read the label before you buy and apply anything. But go ahead and check that out. That gives an effective rotational schedule for how to apply those insecticides. Typically, again, you only need to do them weekly in order to manage sour rot conditions. But if you're having that problem, definitely look into taking care of it. And then again, with birds, we know they're very difficult. We know that every vineyard operation is different. People have different preferences. We still advocate that nets are best when it comes to protecting against bird damage, but ultimately the best is what works for you. So there is an extension publication from the University of New Hampshire that does highlight almost every option commercially available to growers for bird protection. So if you're using something that you know isn't working for you, please find something that does. We know that birds not only contribute to sour rot, but also just complete cluster berry loss in general as those berries get plucked off the rachis and off of their stems. So make sure that you're using proper bird control, make sure you're using late season control for sour rot, and managing throughout the season for disease in general for the best outcome of your fruit. And with that, I'm basically wrapped up. So Todd, if you want to go ahead and take over, I will stop my screen share.
Okay. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and get this up and running. Okay, can everybody hear me and see that well? Can you see that all right, Maria?
Yeah, I'm just going to remove my video pin. Okay, so you should be fully up and pinned. Me and my show. Okay.
Okay. We're good to go?
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks, Maria. That's great. So I think, you know, not only white wine production, but I think that when we're looking at red wine production practices, I think it can even matter more extremely on what we're doing in the vineyard to come through with ultimately a quality product in the end with the wine. So again, I just want to thank everybody for their time in being here today, and Maria, your collaboration and especially your IT assistant, which is better than mine. So as well as OGIC and their effort in supporting our viticulture and enology research and extension activities like this one today. So this is just kind of an outline that we're going to follow and cover. I'm just going to briefly cover the optimum harvest parameters, fruit quality, only briefly because Maria did a good job on it. And we're going to concentrate more on, must processing, fermentation management, those kind of issues here, more so on red wine production here. So Maria already talked about, the season. That's really important. Is it a good vintage? Is it bad? It's hard to tell. Really, we need to start in the spring and note those early frosts that are potential problematic issues that we can see. Are we starting to get, rainfall? Is the summer getting to be humid? That makes those timely spray programs absolutely critical to keep, a quality product coming into the cellar. she talked about wildlife pressure too, that can cause not only a loss of the grapes, but damage from birds, deer, raccoon, turkey. We all know those wildlife pressure, those animals that can be real problematic, and we need to find ways to prevent that. Or potentially, if we're getting close to harvest, close to optimum maturity, is it something that we need to consider? We might have to take it early because of the birds, or work with nets and that kind of thing. Maria did a great job in cultural practices. I really think this is where I didn't talk about it much on the white side, but I really think this is where it's real critical on reds, especially crop load adjustments. We did a study on Chamberson a number of years ago, Dr. Med Damey and I as well, looking at the effects of crop levels, different crop levels on wine quality. And we could see it in anthocyanins, total phenolics, that it really makes a difference. The lower the crop levels that we had, definitely had an increase of quality through those measurements, as well as sensory, that people could pick out in taste panels. So, and great variety, great maturity. Knowing the variety that you have, can it grow well in the region that you're at, the soils where you are, the microclimate, that's all important in picking those varieties that, really we want to make great wine from them. And to do that, it has to be able to grow in that area and mature. I talked about fruit quality last week quite a bit on the white side. So I think there's a way that we can pull that video from last week on it, or you can contact me at any time on fruit quality issues. But we really have to, that's what all these viticultural practices that Maria talked about and that are on this slide, all these practices entail, is trying to keep that fruit as clean as we can, so that we can produce a premium quality wine. And then harvest and holding times I also touched last week on. And really this is just as important with red wines as it is white. We need to harvest those grapes cool. So harvesting at night or early morning when the grapes are cool. If it is a situation where it's warmer during the day, then we can use dry ice or snow, as they call it, to help cool those grapes down in the bins out in the vineyard. Or if we have had the opportunity to have a cooler that we can maybe use a tow motor, take those bins in there. That's something that is great to be able to do. Or maybe it's a reefer unit in the back, a truck reefer unit that we can cool those grapes down. That way we can rest after harvest. We can start fresh the next day, and do a better job with our production practices. And then grower vintner relationships, make sure we're on the same page. Know what each one is looking at, know what we want. And that's something that we can look at for reintroducing another topic on that, which I think could be a good idea. Really, when it comes down to it, let's look at the must handling and processing. Unless we're going to do carbonic maceration, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the grapes should be destemmed and crushed. Typically, I like to see 30 to 50 ppm SO2, and that just depends on grape condition. So about 30 for sound grapes, or grapes that really don't have much in terms of rot. And there are molds that are present that we may not see, or mycelium or something. So that's why I like to see some SO2 in there, even for sound grapes. But as we get a little higher in rot, I like to see more increased levels of SO2, somewhere around 50 parts per million or more if need be. We're not really going to affect any kind of fermentation rates or anything like that. So we definitely need that in there protect from unwanted wild bacteria or yeast from producing off flavors or aromas. Now, this is really the time that the must additions or corrections, such as chaptalization if we need to, any acid manipulation, whether it's adding acid, maybe the pH is high, and that can be critical on red wines to get down below 3.6. Going into primary fermentation, I like to be somewhere 3.5, 3.4 roughly, if possible. That way we're going to have hopefully a little better luck going through fermentation, a little cleaner, less subject to microbial manipulation. We can do tannin additions, which we'll talk about here shortly, as well as enzymes. But really, these must additions are determined by obtaining a representative sample. And Maria mentioned a little bit here on the effect of rain and that we didn't have as much desiccation in our berries or dried berries. That can be problematic in obtaining a representative sample. And that's really because the sugars don't release right away. So it could be a situation where maybe if we crush the grapes, maybe we have to wait a little bit, put them in a cooler environment to make sure that we have a little more time for them sugars to come into solutions from dehydrated berries. Get a little more accurate overall must measurements for Brix, pH, and TA. And as good as those are, that really determines what our additions are going to be, as well as some other things that we can look at, like certainly like the yeast assimilable nitrogen content to know where we are in nutrient levels. But also, we need to be able to monitor these sensorially in the vineyard. As we're getting closer to maturity, we need to be able to taste these grapes, on a weekly, if not bi-weekly basis, and say, where are we on these flavor compounds? Are they where we want to be? Are they peaking? What's the weather looking like next week? And that helps us determine what we're going to do harvest-wise as well. Generally, I like to see large additions or subtractions to the must done at that time, and then we can just fine tune the wine. And I think that's a better approach that's going to overall produce a better quality wine. Looking at the enzyme addition to reds, just like whites I talked about a little bit last week, I think pectinase enzymes do have a role for red wine production. And, they can help, whether we're looking for better yields, increased filterability, which can be important, especially with red wines, because of the glucan and the pectins in there as well. Color extraction and stability, certainly a major value that we determine the quality on for red wine. So enzymes can help in those roles, and just helping extract anthocyanins and the polymeric phenols and tannins that are present there. Just follow manufacturer directions as far as addition rates, any preparation that's involved, and if we are looking to extract color or stability reasons for enzymes, then I would suggest maybe we do it just prior to fermentation or just after it initiates. I think that's about the best time to do it there. Just to show the importance of enzymes on a study we did a number of years ago on Cabernet Franc, where we had 4 treatments. We look at the control, then we were using Scott Lab products, Scott Zyme Color X, Color Pro alone, and then we used both of them together. We can see it had a direct effect on color intensity. So we see that the control was significantly lower than either the Color X or the Color Pro individually. And interestingly enough, the treatment that we had, both Color X and the Color Pro together, had the highest color intensity. And that's really, these two are really ones for color stability, ones for color extraction mainly. So that was interesting. We saw an increase in intensity. We didn't see any difference in hue. Not that I was necessarily expecting it. That's really the shift of red color one way or the other, or it could be a measure of browning. On a sensorial note, looking at taste panel results, this just happened to be for 98 season. The Color X and the Color Pro did show the highest notes of fruity and earthy notes, whereas the control had the highest descriptions of herbaceous and vegetal. So, those are notes that we would rather not achieve or have expressed in our wines. So in this case, it helped on a sensory aspect as well. Tannin additions, that's obviously something as well that we can do. They can build structure, mainly mid-palate structure, and help with the finish of the wine. We see they have the ability to help increase color and stability. This is just increasing the percentage of available bonds between tannin and anthocyanins, and it can result in a more stable polymer or pigment, and it does become less susceptible to SO2 bleaching, which is good. And this is best done prior to the beginning of fermentation here on this aspect. If we have compromised fruit or fruit that has some rot, just like I mentioned with white wines, can help lower the available oxygen because it's a scavenger of oxygen. And also it has a good aspect inhibiting lactase activity, which can be real problematic with rot case scenarios. Obviously, it can also protect our wines from chemical oxidation. And one of the main things that we can look at the use of tannins in red wines is more of a sacrificial tannin. So it really allows, it binds the protein that is in the wine. And we do have protein in wine. We don't think of it as much because we don't necessarily protein stabilize our red wines. However, these tannins that we add can be the sacrificial tannins that bind those proteins, and it leaves the natural skin tannin available that's better on a sensorial note or perception, available for perception on the palate. However, I think we have to be careful. We don't want to overwhelm the natural tannins that are present, or any kind of oak integration that we're planning on doing as well. So we want the varietal character to shine through, and certainly we wouldn't want to have over addition of tannin where that's noticed on the palate more than anything else. Again, it's based on vintage or variety. Maybe it's a light variety like Foch or Baco, some of the older hybrids. We're not going to want to add too much because it can't take that much. So it has to be based on variety and wine style. Some of the hybrids, the tannins are present. We're not extracting all the tannins that are there within the wine matrix that we have, or our procedures that we're doing. So maybe a finishing tannin would be a good option there, just to fine tune that wine, kind of round out the mouthfeel, round out the palate structure. And that could be good for hybrid varieties. And that's something Dr. Anna Catherine Mansfield from Cornell, I have her on board for this year's virtual conference. She's going to discuss a little more on her work on there that she has seen or observed there at Cornell. So that'll be good to take note of. Looking at cold soak, that's another procedure we can do to basically the must of red wine or red varieties. It is thought or reported to increase color. Usually a technique that takes typically anywhere from 1 to 4 days in cooler temperatures, as per se cold soak would indicate. And it can be in combination with pectolytic enzymes as well. And I would suggest that be the case. Can cause color stability where the binding between anthocyanin and other wine phenols, including tannins, can help stabilize color, and especially in the absence of alcohol. This can be a time where this might be more of a factor here, where in the absence of alcohol, we might have increased color stability. Also increase in aromatics through hydrolyzing grape glycosidases, which are bound aroma components. interacting with wine phenols. We can extract more of these out, hopefully. And in some cases, it could be really due to various wild yeasts that might be present that are producing different esters and alcohols that may be there. This is one thing that Dr. James Osborne out in Oregon indicated that they had observed, which is good to note. Also, just increased mouthfeel or suppleness, softness of the wine. And this really comes from some oxygen interaction, whether we're doing just kind of a light punch down during this time, or maybe a brief pump over to help with this oxygen polymerization and interaction with the tannins that are present there. It is not recommended, or I wouldn't recommend it for grapes that contain any rot. One thing we have to watch is any production of ethyl acetate. This can be common, especially in Pinot Noir if we're doing cold soak. And these can come through spoilage organisms like Hensenia spora or Cholera. That's why we need temperatures lower than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, preventing any of these microbial issues. We can also use ways to accomplish this is through dry ice or snow. Dry ice pellets can help. We can use the cold room that we talked about, where we can take the bins via tow motor, or in smaller operations, just pallet jack them into cold rooms. Or maybe we have jacketed tanks, which can be the best case scenario, one of the best ways for temperature control, which I think is really important in a winery. Sulfur dioxide, there's a thought that you want to keep it around 15 milligrams per liter or ppm. That helps so it doesn't bind as much to the phenols and helps form the bonds with the anthocyanins. But if we do have rot, then I would say that we don't do that procedure, or if we still think we'll get some benefit, then I would increase the SO2 to 30 to 50 parts per million in this case. The effectiveness of this, again, will just depend on the variety, fruit composition, and condition. I think some varieties are better than others for cold soak, depending on what we're looking for, the wine style we're trying to get. Bleeding juice reduction, or Saignée as we may know it. It's an available option to help increase color extraction, typically from varieties that are lower in color, like Pinot Noir, or some of the older hybrids I mentioned briefly about. It's thought to concentrate flavors as well, typically because we're increasing the skin to juice ratio, where it's about anywhere from 10 to 30% of the juice is taken off the skins after crushing. So we have that concentrated effect to the skins and the juice. And this is also where we can have the added benefit of doing rosé production from that. So taking that juice, and we can utilize that for rosé production as well. So if we're not, if we're looking for premium rosé production, I would probably look at some alternative procedures, but certainly that could be an added benefit, because primarily this is to increase our red wine flavor compounds and overall quality. After we do bleed, if the grapes are in good condition, we can cold soak. So that's another viable option. But this is good for years where, it could be this year where we had luckily we caught up on maturity, I think, as Maria was mentioning. I wouldn't say it's an absolutely fabulous year, but it could be a year that something like this could be beneficial. Looking at fermentation management, or maybe pomace handling a little closer. Again, it just depends on the vintage, the wine style. Do we have rot as a concern? Maybe then we'd look at thermovinification. And do we have the equipment that we can do some of these procedures? So those are things that we need to address, obviously, well before the harvest starts, to see if we can do these delistage, for example, if we have the equipment to do that. Looking at thermovinification, the original thought, which I have some hesitance about this, is that it's thought to reduce some vegetative character or methoxypyrazines. It's also believed to reduce some of the quote hybrid characters that some people don't like actually. So it can do a pretty good job in that. It's known to enhance fruit aromas, which is good, and also for good color extraction because we're heating these grapes up and leading to good stability. One of the best things I think for thermovinification or hot press or flash detente, different ways to go about that and different equipment is if we do have rot as a concern, this will definitely take this out of the equation where we're going to have a more sound product in the end. But it's a good option for years where kind of questionable vintage, where we're not reaching maturities that we would like. So this could be a viable option for that. Some of the cons may have a little bit less aging potential because we don't have the tannin extraction in there that we would if we were on the skins. However, you know, if it's a good year and we want that good color extraction from maybe it's a variety that's a little weaker in color, then we can actually go back on the skins and get some additional tannin extraction or phenolic extraction, which can be good. There can be a slightly altered sensory profile or a cooked fruit, depending on the technique that we're using. That would probably come more through, you know, steam or a jacketed type heat exchanger system as opposed to delistage or flash detente, which is in vacuum. But you know, that type of system does cost quite a bit, so that can be something that you need to look at. It can exacerbate certain compounds such as methoxypyrazines. I think that if they're higher in concentration, certainly, or green aromas, I don't know that this is a procedure we would want to do. Certainly with Maub, the multicolored Asian lady beetle, you know, wouldn't want to concentrate those flavors. Other wine flaws like ethyl acetate or VA would not necessarily be a procedure we would want to look to. It's just a procedure. We heat the grapes for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, anywhere from 130 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit by steam, heat exchanger, or in a particular flash detente system with vacuum. At OSU, we've used 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 15, 20 minutes. So it just depends, and there's different options available there depending on the vintage on how we can handle that. We tend to see lower amounts of tannin, as I mentioned, but it is more approachable, softer, fruit forward. It can be exciting process to vinify wines with. We can also add enological tannins that help build that mid palate or that body back a little more where we would desire it to. But it depends on wine style. Maybe it's a style that we don't necessarily want a lot of tannin. We want that fruit forward or a little bit of residual sugar or something in there. Certainly that could be a role that this process could entail. This is strictly, we're just showing, we have a steam kettle down in our processing lab where we can heat it up real quick, real fast, and then we can heat these grapes up, press them immediately hot, hence the term hot press, and we can achieve our results with that. Another option we have is carbonic maceration, where we look to ferment whole berries or intact berries in a closed system with carbon dioxide present. And that's essential, is that carbon dioxide, where these grapes will essentially partially ferment their own glycolytic enzymes within the cell or within the grape. Usually takes place several days, after several days, somewhere around 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And the whole thing takes about 8 to 10 days to complete, where we would press it off and then kind of finish off the fermentation if need be, kind of like a white wine. So we retain those fruity esters that we would expect to get out of carbonic maceration, and lower those temperatures and treat it more like a white wine from there. But they tend to be lower in tannin, but again, enhanced fruit structure. I did bring some of these wines to post-fermentation workshop. I think it was last year even, or might have been the previous year. And you could really see structural differences between those that went through pomace contact or maceration compared to carbonic maceration. Just depends what style you're looking for. Good examples, Beaujolais wines made from Gamay Noir, or that type of style we might look for using Pinot Noir. Other red hybrids certainly could be potential options for us there. And we do have, I think, Eric with us from Minnesota. I think this could be an option for Minnesota, or any varieties that we have high acid content that is really from malic acid, because this procedure is really meant to degrade malic acid within that grape berry and change the sensory perception. So this could be a good option potentially for those varieties as well. When we're looking at yeast, I had this slide last week, but it is important for red wines as well, maybe with some different factors. But you know, we look at yeast producers and they have specific recommendations based on, you know, the variety that we're working with, because of some of the fine aromas or flavor compounds we express. I think maybe more specifically, we need to look at, you know, how can that yeast perform in a potential high alcohol content? Can it handle temperatures of 90 to 95 degrees? Does it produce H2S? What are the nutrient requirements? Those are all things that we really need to ask ourselves when choosing the right strain to make sure that we can get through a proper and successful fermentation. Opposed to white wine, where we're looking at low temperatures, red wines can range anywhere from 75 to 90 or 95. Yeast producers don't like to hear 95, but I have gone up that high, and you know, it can extract good color and good phenolics. Generally, fruit forward wines, lower alcohol content, meant to consume earlier, we tend to go a little bit lower, 70, 75, maybe even up to 80, somewhere in that range. Whereas wines meant for increased aging, more complexity due to the increased phenolics that they have, we would want to extract that. We want to get more towards 90 degrees or 95 to get better extraction of color and flavor. It's important to follow manufacturer's directions on rehydration and inoculation of our yeast, as well as our nutrients. And then monitor daily for off aromas, flavors. Again, very important, same as white wine production. And then we need to react accordingly if need be. I had this slide last week. You know, yeast aren't microscopic miracle workers. Make sure everything's in proper order. The grapes are clean, that they can do their job and create the right biomass to have efficient fermentations and successful. Looking at pomace contact, which is important, it depends on vintage, grape condition, what style we want to make. You know, this is essential concerns, and it's based on, you know, really based on maturity, what the vintage looks like, you know, how the seeds are progressing through maturity. But typical fermentations we see are anthocyanins here in black. We see really anywhere from day 4 to 7. We see a peak in anthocyanins. Then the anthocyanins tend to drop off. We might have a little bit more browning hues develop down in here, whereas our tannin levels, they'll keep kind of increase. They increase rapidly at first, and then they'll just steadily increase over time. So that's important to note. And then we also see with temperature, the effect of temperature as we increase temperature, 10, 20, 30 degrees Celsius, we have a significant increase in extracted phenolics. Also with ethanol, as fermentation progresses, we have increases amounts of ethanol, which is really a solvent. So with that solvent, we would expect to extract more phenolics, and that could come from the skins or potentially the seeds as well. So how do we determine what's the best pomace contactors? So it's going to depend on wine style, vintage. If we're going to press prior to completion, or say around 5 degrees Brix, 3 degrees Brix, somewhere in there, we still have residual sugar left. These are really vintages or wines that fermentation lasts 3 to 4 days. These are wines meant to be drunk young. They tend to be rich in tannin or heavy in tannin, most likely from pretty good vintages. Fruit forwardness is important here. Whereas if we go to completion or cap fall, these are usually from excellent vintage conditions. We're looking at more complexity, more maturity, ripe fruit, good tannins with excellent aging potential. Then we have extended maceration, and these are from, good to average vintages. I wouldn't say necessarily these are optimum or the best vintages that we have, because we're looking actually over time to have a little polymerization with those, with oxygen and tannins, to help kind of progress these wines for longer release dates and slower aging. Looking a little more extended maceration. Many of us may not have done this in the past, but it's traditionally used in various parts of Europe. Again, good to average maturity, looking at both grape and seed maturity, but where we want a softening of that tannin over time. And this can occur basically after cap fall, where we would close the vessel. So it's in a CO2 environment. We really don't have to worry about oxidation too much at this point. So anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks after cap fall. So it could be, even up to 30 days after fermentation really is complete. Temperatures brought down to more of an ambient or room temperature. Our punch downs would cease. We would reduce, any kind of pump overs or anything like that. We don't need that. So we're looking at just maybe slight oxygen integration over time. We will see a potential reduction in anthocyanin, or maybe just a shifting of that hue, but we're going to gain benefit on softening these tannins, increased complexity with some good tannins that are also there. This is just a slide that shows a study we did on Cabernet Franc anthocyanin concentrate. We also did it on Chamberson that we saw. So as we progress in fermentation, going from 5-0 Brix dryness to extended maceration, we did see a reduction in anthocyanins, but we saw that increase in tannin or phenolic value over time, where we saw extended maceration had significantly higher amount of phenolic content or extraction. Other methods that we have that we can employ, certainly can play a role. We just don't have time to talk about them today. Something like delestage or micro-ox. I don't necessarily think these are methods that are essential to premium wine production, but we certainly could have them in our arsenal. Malolactic fermentation, talked about last week. I think it's more important even so in reds, because we more commonly perform this in reds. We can do it either sequentially or co-inoculation. I really prefer sequentially in reds. We need warm temperatures for our fermentation rates anyway. So we need to have the ability to have 70 degrees Fahrenheit to make it optimum for successful MLs. Don't add SO2 prior to inoculating for ML. So, those kind of things. pH matters more, really specifically with white wines. So lower pHs around 3.1, they're more challenging than where we're at in reds, anywhere from 3.4 to 3.7, roughly in that range. Shouldn't be a problem. We can carry over lees, and it's recommended. but no headspace for ML, because those lees, as long as they're good and they're not off or smelly, those provide a good nutrient source for ML. So just rehydrate and inoculate according to manufacturer directions, and we should hopefully have good success with malolactic. Sulfur oxide dose that we're in last week, this is still, despite it being red wine, it's still one of the most important things I think we need to monitor and maintain. Even though, we have more tannins in reds and they can bind oxygen, it's still mostly detrimental after fermentation is over. These are just the essential times. I'm not going to discuss anything further here because I believe these are being recorded and we can get this information, or certainly call me at any time with any questions that you have. Oxygen uptake, again, red wines can take more oxygen. Doesn't mean that we're going to be not suspect to oxidation or microbial issues. We can have a lot of flaws that develop in red wines strictly due to, a lot of times it's a combination of low SO2 or no SO2 and higher than desired oxygen. So that can be problematic. And I talked about this a lot last week. Mainly here, we can lower it a little bit. I would say we can be at 0.5 to 0.6 parts per million molecular free SO2, whereas whites definitely would suggest being at 0.8 parts per million. Now, if we have residual sugar in our wines, that's another issue. I would say I would probably look to go back up to 0.8 parts per million molecular for our red wines to keep quality intact. Again, I talked about this last week in white wines, but it's still very important. Limit sources where we can pick up oxygen, like cold stabilization. Anytime we move wine from one tank to another, or after fining or anything like that, certainly we want to make sure our SO2s are up and purge prior to movement the transfer lines, receiving vessels with an appropriate inert gas. And this is just a recommended level of 1.25 milligrams per liter for red wine as a target level after bottling. I think fining and blending, again, we talked about last week, so I'm just going to mention, I think could be more critical to red wines actually. And that's just because of the increased amount of phenolic and tannin levels that we have in red wines, and trying to balance them out, making sure they're not too harsh. Color can be important. Aromatics, just like in white wine. Maybe we'll need to do a little more fine tuning with casein or egg white fining to bring these tannins and these phenolics together, or blending certainly has a big role in increasing mid palate color. Those types of things can be very important in red wine production. Something that we certainly need to be paying attention to coming up here in our own cellars with this current vintage. Sterile bottling, again, very important. I am a proponent of filtration to red wines. I think I take the view of Pinot, Emile Pinot, that anytime we have a cleaner wine, cleaner red wine, it's going to be a better wine sensorially and on the palate than if it has sedimentation. So, and a lot of these sediments can be from bacteria that are present. So I think it's we need to practice this throughout vinification. But sterile bottling is important for sterilization of the bottling line and filter unit, and mainly that comes through hot water at 180 or steam, which are the best practices for clean in place or bottling lines. And that makes the actual filtration one of the most important steps. I think we can actually go to 0.6 on reds as opposed to 0.45, so not quite as tight. We may not get quite all daughter cells, but we're still going to be pretty efficient here. The wines are going to be dry. There's SO2 in there, higher alcohol levels. So I think we're going to be pretty good here. And this is accomplished through membrane or absolute filtration. Need to be able to do the bubble point test as well. talked to somebody yesterday about this, actually. So those are all important things, I think, for, to make sure that we have a quality product and it's going to last. Shelf life potential is good. Laboratory analysis, absolutely critical. Mentioned this last week. Same as white wines, no difference on the red side. So we need to know where we're at chemically in the lab to know what's going on with that wine and how to produce a premium quality wine. So with that, I'm going to open it back up